In 1992, a decorated detective sergeant left her station after a long shift and vanished. She wasn't just any officer, she was one of the best. She chased dangerous criminals, exposed corruption, and made powerful enemies. So when she suddenly disappeared, the entire city froze. Search teams scoured forests, rivers, even abandoned houses. Flyers were everywhere. Reporters covered it day and night, but there was no trace. It was like she had been erased from the earth. Her family begged for answers. Rumors exploded. Did she run away? Was she kidnapped? Or was this an inside job? For 13 years, the case went cold. And then, during a simple property inspection, a locked cellar door was discovered. What was behind it would shock the nation and prove that the truth was far darker than anyone imagined. Stay with me, because once you hear what investigators found, you'll never look at this case the same way again. And hey, before we start, make sure to hit subscribe, because we tell real stories that keep you up at night. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching this from? It was a Thursday evening in 1992, and Detective Sergeant Claire Nolan was finishing her shift. She had been on duty all day, mostly paperwork and routine calls. Her coworkers later said she looked tired but calm, like someone who had been running on little sleep but didn't want to complain. Claire had built a reputation for being steady under pressure. Even when she was exhausted, she kept her focus. That night she chatted briefly with another officer before heading out. Nothing in her behavior suggested anything unusual. No stress, no panic, no sign of fear. She gathered her things, tucked her files away, and said goodnight to her team. The clock was nearing 9 p.m. when she walked across the parking lot toward her car. It was cold outside, the kind of chill that made people move quickly to get home. A few officers noticed her coat pulled tightly around her shoulders. She got into her car, started the engine, and pulled out of the lot. For most officers, this moment would have been the least memorable part of their day. But for Claire Nolan, it would be the last time her coworkers ever saw her alive. At the time, no one thought twice about it. She was just driving home like she always did. Later, those same coworkers would replay that night in their heads over and over again, trying to figure out if they had missed something. A look, a word, a sign that she was in danger. But there was nothing. On the surface, it was an ordinary end to an ordinary shift. The drive from the station to Claire's home was short, less than 20 minutes. She knew the route by heart. It was the same road she had taken for years, through quiet neighborhoods and a few stretches of dark highway. At that hour, traffic was light. No witnesses reported anything unusual. Her car was seen passing through a stoplight around 9 to 10 p.m. She was driving normally. No speeding. No sudden stops, nothing suspicious. The streets that night were calm. Businesses had closed, and only a handful of cars moved along the roads. For Claire, it should have been one of those peaceful drives home where the silence of the night gave her a chance to breathe after a long shift. But something happened between the police station and her front door. To this day, no one knows exactly what. She didn't make any phone calls. She didn't stop for gas or groceries. She didn't swing by a friend's house. Every sign points to her driving straight home. At 9:25 p.m., neighbors would later confirm seeing her car pulling into her street. The headlights cut across the dark houses before the engine went quiet. To them, it was just another neighbor coming home late from work. Nobody thought to look twice. But what happened after she parked remains the mystery. Did someone approach her before she could walk inside? Did she willingly step out to meet someone she knew? Or was she forced away before she ever touched the front door? Investigators have spent years trying to answer those questions. What they know is that from the moment her car shut off, Detective Sergeant Claire Nolan seemed to vanish from the face of the earth. The next morning, neighbors noticed Claire's car still sitting outside her home. It was parked neatly along the curb, nothing unusual about it. At first, nobody thought anything was wrong. But as the day went on, things didn't add up. Her house looked untouched. The curtains were still drawn, the mailbox filled with mail. Family members expected her to call, but the phone stayed silent. By late afternoon, concern grew. A close friend stopped by, knocking on the front door. No answer. The car was there, but Claire was. That was when the alarm truly began. Police officers rushed to the scene. They searched the car. Inside, nothing was out of place, keys gone, no broken glass, no signs of a fight. To anyone looking in, it seemed like Claire had simply parked and walked away. But then came the detail that made everything far darker. Inside the house, investigators found her wallet, her badge, and her service weapon, all untouched, locked away in her bedroom. It was the kind of discovery that sent chills through the department. If Claire had planned to leave on her own, why would she leave behind the very item she needed most? Her badge and gun were part of her identity. Something wasn't right. Within hours, the department had to face an impossible truth. One of their own detectives had disappeared. By evening, Claire's family knew something was wrong. She was always in touch. If she worked late, she called. If she planned to stop somewhere, she let them know. That night, the phone never rang. At first, they tried to stay calm. Maybe she was still at the station finishing reports. Maybe she had been called into a late assignment. But as the hours stretched past midnight, fear set in. Her mother kept packing the kitchen, checking the clock again and again. Her sibling tried calling her number over and over, but there was no answer. The next morning, when they learned her car was parked outside her home but she wasn't inside, panic turned to dread. Something wasn't right. This wasn't like Claire. By the afternoon, her family officially filed a missing person report. They knew the weight of that step. Once it was filed, the clock started ticking. Every hour that passed without answers made the chances of finding her worse. The officers who took the report listened carefully. It wasn't every day that a detective sergeant's own family came in, desperate, saying they couldn't reach her. The tension in the room was heavy. This wasn't just another case. When the missing person report reached the station, everything changed. This wasn't a teenager skipping curfew or a traveler getting lost. This was Detective Sergeant Claire Nolan, one of their own. The department scrambled. Calls went out to every officer on duty. Teams were organized to search her neighborhood. Detectives started pulling her case files, wondering if one of her investigations had caught up with her. It was chaos behind the scenes. No one wanted to believe it, but the fact was clear. A highly trained officer had vanished without a trace. Commanders held urgent meetings. Media inquiries started pouring in. Reporters caught wind of the disappearance within hours and headlines spread quickly. Detective missing, foul play suspected. For the officers who had worked beside her, the shock cut deep. Claire wasn't just another colleague. She was respected, tough, and dedicated. Now they were staring at her empty desk and realizing she had become the very kind of case she used to solve. The department's job was no longer to protect Claire's investigations. Their job was to find her. The first night after Claire's disappearance, the search began immediately. Police officers, deputies, and volunteers gathered around her neighborhood. Floodlights lit up the dark streets, cutting across yards and trees. This wasn't a normal missing person call. This was one of their own, and that urgency was everywhere. Helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights sweeping the woods and fields nearby. K-9 units arrived, handlers guiding dogs through tall grass, alleys, and wooded trails. Every rustle in the leaves felt like it could be her. Every shadow was checked, every noise investigated. Officers shouted her name as they moved through the night, hopping for an answer. Radios buzzed constantly with updates. Nothing in the east sector. Dog lost the scent. Check that shed. Neighbors stood on their porches, wrapped in coats, watching in shock. The sight of so many officers searching for a fellow detective hit them hard. They realized this was not an ordinary case. Something terrible had happened. Hours passed, but no sign of Claire appeared. The floodlights burned through the night, but when dawn came, the search lines were still empty. The police were left with the unthinkable. A detective sergeant had vanished, and nobody knew where she went. By the next morning, the story was everywhere. Local TV stations broke into programming with urgent updates. Detective missing, massive search underway. Reporters gathered outside the police station, shoving microphones at anyone who would speak. Claire's photo, her official police portrait, was printed on flyers by the hundreds. Volunteers stapled them to telephone poles, taped them to shop windows, and handed them to strangers on the street. Her face was suddenly everywhere. People who didn't even know Claire felt shaken. If a decorated detective could vanish from her own home, then no one was safe. Parents held their kids closer. Businesses started donating food and water to search teams. Churches held prayer vigils. The city wasn't just worried, it was on edge. Everywhere, rumors spread. Some said she was kidnapped by someone she arrested years ago. Others whispered about police corruption. Many simply begged for answers. At the center of it all, her family stood in front of cameras, pleading for help. Her mother's voice cracked as she begged anyone with information to come forward. Her sibling vowed not to stop searching until the truth was found. The community listened, and for a time, the whole city seemed united. Everyone wanted to believe Claire could still be found alive. A week into the search, hope flickered when a team reported possible evidence. Deep in the woods, dogs picked up a scent. Not far away, searchers found faint footprints in the dirt and what looked like a scrap of fabric. For a moment, excitement rippled through the search lines. Radios lit up with chatter. Investigators rushed to the site, hearts racing that this could finally be the break. Family members were notified. Maybe this was it. But then reality crashed down. The footprints didn't match Claire's shoes. The fabric wasn't from her clothes. Tests showed it had been there for months. The same cycle repeated over and over. A shallow grave uncovered by hikers, wrong age, wrong gender. Bones discovered near a river, animal remains. A sighting at a gas station proved false. Each time the family's hopes lifted, then shattered. The emotional toll was crushing. Reporters called it the detective who became the mystery. Searchers kept combing through fields, woods, and rivers, but no real answers came. Slowly, the buzz of helicopters faded. The search parties grew smaller. Flyers began to peel and fade from the poles where they were posted. Claire Nolan was still gone, and no one knew why. As weeks turned into months, the case turned into something else, a wildfire of rumors. One day, a caller claimed to have seen Claire at a gas station 2 towns away. They said she looked nervous, as if she was running from someone. Police rushed to check security footage. Hours later, the truth came out. It wasn't her, just another woman who happened to look similar. Another rumor spread when someone claimed Claire had made a phone call from a payphone at a bus stop. Detectives tracked down the supposed call. Records showed nothing. It had never happened. The strangest claim came from a man who told reporters Claire had chosen to disappear. According to him, she was tired of her job, tired of the danger, and had started a new life somewhere far away. The idea spread like wildfire. Some people even believed it, but her family refused to accept it. They knew Claire. She would never abandon them. Each rumor started with excitement, then ended in disappointment. Every false lead wasted time, money, and hope. Detectives grew frustrated. The family grew exhausted. Soon, whispers took on a darker tone. Maybe someone powerful didn't want her found. By the end of the first year, Claire's family was breaking down. They had appeared on TV over and over, faces pale with exhaustion, voices cracking with grief. Her mother spoke directly into cameras, tears sliding down her face, begging anyone with information to help. Her siblings stood beside her, trying to stay strong, saying they would never give up searching. The images played on every channel. But behind the cameras, things were even worse. Sleepless nights, endless calls that went nowhere. Every knock at the door made their hearts stop, only to find it was a neighbor, a reporter, or a stranger with another false story. The pain was crushing. At times, they wondered if they were mourning a death without proof. That silence, the not knowing, was worse than anything. When reporters asked if they believed Claire was still alive, her mother's answer was soft but firm. "I have to believe it. If I don't, I'll lose her twice." Weeks became months, and the energy of the search slowly faded. The floodlights, the helicopters, the daily briefings, gone. Now only a handful of detectives worked the case, and even they seemed worn down. Behind closed doors, some officers admitted what no one wanted to say out loud. They had nothing. No body. No real evidence. No answers. It was as if Detective Sergeant Claire Nolan had been swallowed by the earth. For the family, the silence was unbearable. Each day without news felt like another death. They didn't know if she was alive, suffering, or already gone. That not knowing ate at them, worse than grief. They began to notice the way police avoided certain questions. When asked if Claire's work might have made her a target, the answers were vague. When asked about possible corruption, the subject was quickly changed. It left the family with a chilling thought. Maybe someone powerful didn't want the truth uncovered. At night, her siblings sat at the kitchen table, staring at stacks of flyers, clippings, and dead-end tips. They promised themselves they wouldn't let the case fade, even if it meant standing alone. The silence was heavy and it felt permanent, but under that silence, whispers were beginning to spread, whispers that pointed toward something much darker. By the second year of Claire's disappearance, quiet whispers started spreading inside the department. Officers who once dismissed rumors now admitted something darker might be at play. One detective put it simply, "If this can happen to her, it can happen to any of us." The thought that terrified everyone was the same. What if her disappearance wasn't random? What if it was an inside job? Officially, no one said those words at press conferences. But behind closed doors, the conversations were different. Some officers admitted they felt uneasy about how quickly the case seemed to stall, how leads were dropped without explanation, how certain names never made it into official reports. One officer remembered the night Claire vanished. He said the search had felt more like a performance than a mission. "It was like some people already knew we weren't going to find her," he said. Not everyone believed it, but the idea grew stronger with time. If Claire had been targeted, it would have taken planning, knowledge of her routine, knowledge of her weaknesses. And who had more access to that information than the people she worked beside every single day? As detectives looked back on Claire's final months, another detail stood out. She had been receiving threats. At the time, she had been leading investigations into organized crime. Some of the people she was pursuing were dangerous: drug traffickers, extortionists, violent gang members. They had money, connections, and reach, and Claire was pressing hard against them. Colleagues remembered her joking about anonymous calls, a voice telling her to stop digging, letters left on her desk with no return address. At first, she brushed them off, saying threats came with the job, but then they started getting more specific. One message warned her, "Back off or you'll disappear too." Another officer admitted he had even pulled her aside, urging her to slow down. "You're making enemies who won't just sit back," he told her. But Claire never backed down. She believed in the law. She believed in finishing what she started. And maybe that was what sealed her fate. Looking back, many officers wondered if the threats weren't just bluffs. What if they were promises? Promises that had finally been carried out. In the years after her disappearance, detectives reopened Claire's old files. They hoped her work might point to her enemies. What they found was chilling. Her case files listed names of criminals who were still active. Some were smugglers. Some were violent gang leaders. Some were white-collar players hiding behind money and power. Many of them had escaped convictions because evidence mysteriously went missing or witnesses backed out at the last second. As the files were reviewed, a disturbing pattern appeared. Several of the men and women she had been closing in on had deep ties, not just to street crime but to city officials, judges, politicians, even law enforcement. One detective admitted, "It was like opening a door we weren't supposed to touch." The deeper they looked, the clearer it became. Claire hadn't just been chasing criminals. She had been threatening the balance of power for people who could afford to stay hidden. And those were the kinds of enemies who didn't forgive. The files told a story that no one in the department wanted to say out loud. Claire Nolan may have vanished not because of bad luck, but because she had gotten too close to the truth. As detectives dug deeper into Claire's files, the trail grew darker. It wasn't just organized crime she had been pushing against. It was something bigger. Connections started to appear. A gang leader she had been investigating had once been seen leaving a fundraiser hosted by a local politician. A drug trafficker she had nearly taken down had financial ties to a city contractor with government deals. Even a respected police officer showed up in her notes, flagged for suspicious meetings with known criminals. At first, investigators thought it was coincidence, But the more they compared names, the clearer it became. The criminals Claire had been fighting weren't just street-level thugs. They were protected by people in power. One detective described it as walking into dangerous ground. Every new link felt like peeling back a layer of something designed to stay hidden, and every time they tried to move forward, files went missing, or requests for information were delayed. It was as if invisible hands were pulling the strings, making sure the truth stayed buried. The suspicion grew heavy. If Claire had uncovered too much, maybe her disappearance wasn't just about crime. Maybe it was about keeping corruption in the shadows, where it could never be exposed. While detectives wrestled with secrets, Claire's family refused to give up. Her younger sibling, Mark, became the face of the fight. He stood in front of cameras year after year, holding Claire's photo, demanding answers. He told reporters the truth that police seemed unwilling to say. If Claire had been a regular citizen, her case might have been forgotten. But she was. She was one of their own. Mark believed the silence meant something bigger was being hidden, and he wasn't afraid to say it. He accused the department of dragging its feet. He called out city leaders who promised support but delivered nothing. His voice carried the pain of someone who had lost not just a sister, but also faith in the system she had worked to protect. The family organized vigils. They passed out flyers even years after the disappearance. They refused to let her name fade into the background of cold cases. For the public, Mark became a symbol of hope and defiance. And for those who wanted Claire's story buried, his persistence was a problem they couldn't silence. By the 10th year of Claire's disappearance, the relationship between her family and the police was broken. At first, they had leaned on the department for support, but with every year that passed, the answers stayed the same. No leads, no evidence, no progress. To the family, it started to feel less like failure and more like avoidance. Meetings with investigators grew tense. When Mark pushed for updates, he got vague replies. When he asked about corruption or inside involvement, the room went silent. It was as if there were walls around the truth, walls the police refused to break. At one point, Mark walked out of a meeting furious. He told reporters the police weren't just slow, they were protecting someone. His words spread fast, fueling public suspicion that something deeper was being hidden. Behind closed doors, officers bristled. Some truly wanted answers but felt blocked by higher-ups. Others thought the family was making reckless accusations. The trust that once united them was gone. For the family, the message was clear. If justice was going to happen, they couldn't just rely on the police. They would have to fight for it themselves. In 1997, 5 years after Claire vanished, a call came into the department. A hunter had discovered human remains deep in the woods outside town. For the first time in years, investigators felt a rush of hope and fear. Could this finally be Claire? Search teams flooded the forest. Reporters crowded the roadside, cameras ready. The family waited by the phone, hearts pounding. If the remains belonged to Claire, at least they would finally know. Detectives carefully examined the scene. A woman's body, badly decomposed, lay hidden under brush and leaves. For investigators, the uniform and badge weren't there, but the possibility still hung heavy. The remains were rushed to the coroner's office. For 2 days, the family lived in torment, bracing for confirmation. Then the tests came back. The body was Claire. It was another missing woman from the area. For her family, relief clashed with heartbreak. They were glad it was Claire, but devastated they were back at square one. The police called it progress. The family called it torture. Every false lead reminded them of the nightmare. Claire could be anywhere, and the waiting never stopped. In 2001, nearly a decade after Claire vanished, another discovery set off alarms. 2 hikers exploring the hills outside the city stumbled across scattered bones. They quickly called police, and within hours the area swarmed with investigators. Hope ignited once again. Could this finally be her? The bones looked old, but no one knew for sure. Detectives marked off the site, collecting every fragment with care. Back at the lab, forensic experts began the testing. The family sat by the phone, reliving the same nightmare they'd endured before. They begged for news, desperate for closure. Days later, the results arrived. The bones were human, but not Claire's. They belonged to a man who had died decades earlier. His identity was never fully confirmed. The family's hope collapsed once again. For them, it felt cruel. Every discovery of bones dragged them into fresh pain, only to leave them with nothing. Reporters kept asking, how many times would this happen? How many times would a possible answer turn to dust? To the public, Claire had become a symbol of mystery. To her family, she was still a sister, a daughter, lost and still waiting to be found. In 2003, a new tip came in, this one stranger than the rest. A caller claimed Claire hadn't been killed. Instead, he said, she had been kidnapped and smuggled overseas. According to the story, she was alive, being held in another country. The idea was shocking, but investigators couldn't ignore it. They traced the call, interviewed the tipster, and even contacted foreign agencies to check. For a moment, the family's hope lit up again. Could she really be alive after all these years? Detectives followed the lead as far as it would go, but soon cracks appeared. The caller gave details that didn't match the timeline. He changed his story in each interview. Finally, investigators confirmed the truth. It was a hoax. The man had fabricated the entire story for attention. For the family, the news hit like a cruel joke. Every false claim tore at their hope, but this one was different. It wasn't just wrong, it was deliberate. After more than a decade of waiting, they began to wonder if the truth would ever come. By the early 2000s, the media began to shift the way it spoke about Claire Nolan. At first, her story had been front-page news. Headlines screamed about the missing detective, the searches, and the desperate family. But as the years dragged on, the tone changed. Reporters started calling it one of the strangest cases ever. Some even labeled it unsolvable. Television shows and newspapers replayed the same details over and over, often focusing on the mystery rather than the woman herself. To the public, Claire became less of a person and more of a riddle, a puzzle to be debated, not a daughter or sister who was loved. Her family hated it. They would watch news segments that described her disappearance as if it were entertainment. Reporters would say, "The detective who became the mystery," as though that phrase somehow summed up everything. Behind closed doors, the family struggled. Every time they heard those words, they felt she was slipping further away from being remembered as a real person. She had been a professional, a fighter for justice. But now her identity was overshadowed by the mystery of her end. To them, this wasn't a riddle. It was life, death, and unbearable silence. As if the family hadn't suffered enough, another rumor began to spread. Some in the media and even a few officers quietly suggested a different theory. Maybe Claire had chosen to vanish. Maybe she was overwhelmed by the stress of her work. Maybe she was hiding from something. The idea cut deep. For her family, it felt like betrayal. They knew Claire. She was dedicated to her job, loved her family, and never once showed signs of wanting to walk away. But rumors spread like wildfire. Talk radio shows speculated she might have started a new life. A tabloid even ran a story claiming she had been spotted living under a new name. None of it had proof, but the whispers hurt all the same. Mark, her younger brother, spoke out angrily. "She didn't leave us. She didn't walk away. Someone took her." His words made headlines, but the damage was done. To the family, the suggestion that Claire left on her own was almost worse than her being gone. It painted her as someone who abandoned them, when in truth, she had been the victim of something far darker. Through all the noise, the false leads, the rumors, the endless speculation, Claire Nolan's family held onto one truth. She did not leave by choice. They remembered how much she loved her work. She fought to protect her city. She carried her badge with pride. She believed in justice, even when it put her in danger. They remembered her laughter at family dinners, the way she always showed up for birthdays, the way she cared for her younger brother Mark when their parents were sick. Claire was steady, loyal, and present. To suggest she would abandon all of that was unthinkable. So while the media spun their theories and the police quietly let the case cool, her family stood firm. They went on record again and again, saying the same thing. Claire did not walk away. Someone took her. Someone knows. To them, it wasn't just about finding her. It was about refusing to let her be erased. Every rumor that painted her as weak or selfish was a slap in the face. They pushed back hard, even when no one wanted to listen. Something darker was being ignored, they believed, and until the truth came out, they would never stop fighting. In early 2005, a small rural property about 30 miles outside the city was finally being put up for sale. The house had been sitting empty for years. The windows were cracked, weeds grew tall around the porch, and the roof sagged. Most neighbors avoided it, calling it an eyesore. When a buyer showed interest, a team of workers was sent in to clear the place and check the structure. From the start, they noticed something strange about the basement. The air down there felt heavy, like it hadn't been touched in a long time. The walls were lined with moisture, and in the corner, parts of the cement looked newer than the rest, as if someone had tried to patch or hide something. The workers mentioned it to the inspector, who decided to take a closer look. He expected maybe mold, maybe structural damage, maybe even pests. But what he found was far more unsettling. Behind a pile of old furniture, the inspector noticed boards nailed roughly against a section of wall. They weren't part of the original design. They looked like someone's attempt to cover up a doorway. It was odd, it was out of place, and it was only the beginning. The workers began pulling the old boards away. Dust fell, the nails groaned, and slowly the hidden section was revealed. Behind the boards was a door, a heavy metal door. It was strange because no one had seen it listed on the property's blueprints. The hinges were rusted, the edges sealed with layers of paint and cement, almost as if someone had tried to erase it. The workers stared at it in silence. A locked door in a basement, covered and hidden. Why? At first, they thought it might just be a storage area, but the way it had been sealed off didn't feel right. One worker joked nervously, "It looks like they didn't want anyone to ever find this." The inspector tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It wasn't just locked. It felt like it had been welded shut at some point. That was when the mood in the room shifted from curious to uneasy. The workers backed up, unsure of what they were even looking at. Someone finally said what they were all thinking. This needed to be reported. Within hours, the police were called. What started as a routine inspection was about to explode into the discovery of a lifetime. When the workers reported the sealed door, local police didn't waste time. Within an hour, a patrol car pulled up to the rundown house. Two officers went down into the basement with flashlights. At first glance, it looked ordinary, just a dusty, damp basement full of broken furniture. But then their lights fell on the door. It wasn't normal. The seal, the cement edges, the way it had been boarded up, this wasn't storage. This was hiding. The officers traded uneasy looks. What could be behind it? Old junk? Maybe illegal goods, or was it something much worse? They radioed for backup. Soon, more officers arrived, followed by detectives. The mood in the house grew heavy. The longer they stared at the door, the clearer it became. Someone had gone to great lengths to keep this space hidden. The senior detective ordered the area secured. Neighbors began gathering outside as word spread. No one knew what was about to happen, but the tension was undeniable. Standing in that damp basement, officers felt like they were standing at the edge of something sinister. And when the tools arrived to break it open, everyone braced for what they might find. The officers brought in heavy tools, crowbars, hammers, even a small saw. The old boards had already been cleared, but the door itself was another matter. The hinges were rusted, the lock frozen solid. It resisted every pull. Finally, with a loud crack, the lock gave way. The door groaned as it swung open for the first time in years. A wave of stale air poured out. It smelled thick, like something trapped and forgotten. The officers raised their flashlights and stepped back, waiting for the dust to settle. The room beyond was silent. The beam of light revealed concrete walls, a dirt floor, and shadows that seemed to stretch forever. Nothing moved. No sound came from inside. One officer finally stepped forward, flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. The air felt wrong, like they weren't supposed to be in there. Another officer followed. They swept the light across the room. At first glance, the space looked empty, just an old, hidden cellar. But everyone knew this wasn't a normal find. The way it had been locked away, someone had wanted this place to stay buried. Whatever secret it held had been sealed for over a decade. As the officers stepped into the cellar, their flashlights cut through the darkness. At first, the room seemed bare, just dust, cobwebs, and silence. But then, in the far corner, one of the beams froze. There, slumped against the wall, were bones, human bones. The silence in the room grew heavier. No one spoke. They moved closer, and that's when they saw it. Fragments of fabric still clung to the skeleton. Not just any fabric, dark navy blue, faded but unmistakable. A police uniform. The officers exchanged stunned looks. This wasn't just a body. This was someone who had worn the same badge they wore. Someone who had once been one of them. Then the light caught something else. A small glint of metal near the hip. They leaned down, brushing away dust. It was a badge, tarnished but still readable. The number stamped into it was faint but visible. Everyone in the room felt a chill. They didn't even need the official check. The number was burned into their memory. It matched the missing detective sergeant who had vanished 13 years earlier. The nightmare they had searched for was here, in this hidden room. The badge was rushed back to the department. It didn't take long for confirmation. The number matched exactly. After 13 long years, the missing detective sergeant had finally been found. News spread instantly. By nightfall, every television station, every newspaper, every radio broadcast was carrying the same headline: "Detective found after 13 years." But the shock was not just about her being found. It was about where. A hidden cellar, locked away on an abandoned property, sealed from the world. And she had been left there all this time. Crowds gathered outside the property. Cameras rolled. Reporters asked the same questions again and again. Who put her there? How long had she been kept alive? And why had no one found this sooner? For her family, the news was crushing. They had begged for answers for over a decade. Now, the answer was in front of them, but it was worse than they ever imagined. The uniform fragments, the badge, the hidden cellar, it painted a picture of something dark, something intentional. This was not a simple disappearance. The nation was horrified. And yet the biggest question remained: who had done this? Within hours, the property was locked down. Yellow tape went up, and the cellar became the center of a crime scene 13 years in the making. Forensic teams arrived with cameras, gloves, and evidence bags. The officers who had first entered were moved out. Specialists now stepped carefully into the small, hidden room. Their flashlights lit up the walls, the floor, the corners. Every inch mattered. Nothing was touched at first. Photographs came before anything else. They snapped hundreds of shots, the skeleton in its position, the badge, the scraps of uniform, even the dust patterns on the floor. To them, this was not just a body dump. It looked too controlled, too intentional. One expert bent down to the floor and brushed away layers of dirt. Another examined the walls. Slowly, they began to realize something chilling. This place wasn't built as a simple hiding spot. The sealed door, the careful construction, the way the cellar was concealed, it suggested planning. The team exchanged looks. This wasn't just a burial. This was a space that had been used for something more than hiding a body. The questions shifted from who killed her to what happened down here before she died. The next discoveries made that question even darker. Against the far wall, investigators spotted iron rings drilled into the concrete. Chains were attached, short and rusted but still strong. The position was clear: restraints. Nearby in the dust were scraps of plastic wrappers. They were old and brittle but still readable. Food brands from the early 1990s. Someone had been eating here. One investigator crouched and pointed to the marks on the floor. Scratches, uneven dents, the kind made when someone had struggled against restraints. The room was no longer just a hiding place. It was a prison. The team stepped back, the weight of it sinking in. If the missing detective's body was here and these items were here, the meaning was clear. She hadn't been killed right away. She had been kept alive, locked in this cellar, chained to the wall, fed just enough to survive. For how long, no one knew. The silence of the cellar seemed louder now. The air, stale and heavy, carried the memory of suffering. For investigators, the horror deepened. The case wasn't just about murder anymore. It was about captivity and cruelty that had lasted far longer than anyone had imagined. While forensics worked in the cellar, Another team dug into paperwork. They wanted to know who had owned this property. The trail led back over a decade. In the early 1990s, the home had belonged to a man named Victor Hale. Hale wasn't just any local. He was a violent criminal with deep ties to organized crime. Detectives pulled her old case files, and there it was. Claire Nolan had personally investigated Victor Hale. She had testified against him in court, trying to connect him to drug trafficking and violent assaults. The timing was chilling. Her disappearance happened only months after she had moved to shut down one of his operations. Neighbors back then had said Hale was dangerous, the kind of man people didn't cross, but after the mid-90s he seemed to vanish. Some thought he left the country, others believed he had protection. And now, years later, his former property held the answer to one of the nation's darkest mysteries. The thought hit hard. Claire had been locked in the home of the very man she was trying to bring down. This was no coincidence. But the investigation didn't stop with Hale. As detectives traced connections, something even darker began to surface. Victor Hale had never acted alone. He had friends in high places, politicians, businessmen, and, disturbingly, some police officers. Old reports showed cases against him falling apart. Evidence went missing. Witnesses changed their stories. It looked less like bad luck and more like protection. The deeper investigators looked, the more troubling it became. Claire had been pushing hard to expose Hale and his network. She had been vocal about corruption inside the system. And then, she vanished. Now, with her body found in Hale's old cellar, suspicions grew that this wasn't just a criminal act. It could have been betrayal from within. Had officers looked the other way when she disappeared? Or worse, had some helped cover it up? For her family, the thought was unbearable. For investigators, it was dangerous. To dig too far meant risking reputations, careers, and possibly their own safety. Still, the evidence was there. Claire wasn't only the victim of a criminal. She may have been the victim of a system that failed her, or even destroyed her. When detectives briefed the family, they spoke carefully. The evidence from the cellar suggested Claire hadn't been killed right away. The restraints, the wrappers, the condition of the bones, it all pointed to captivity. She had lived inside that hidden room, suffering in silence. The words hit like knives. For 13 years, her family had prayed for answers. But this truth was far worse than they ever imagined. Her younger sibling broke down in tears. She was alive. All that time she was alive. Her parents, now older and weaker, sat stunned. It wasn't only the grief of losing her. It was the horror of imagining what she had gone through, days turning to weeks, weeks to months, locked underground. The family clung to each other. They wanted to scream, to rage at the system, at the criminals, at whoever had allowed this to happen. But they also realized, finally, they knew where she was. She hadn't walked away. She hadn't abandoned them. She had fought until the very end. It was unbearable, and yet it was the truth they had begged for. The words missing person no longer applied. After 13 years, Claire Nolan was found. Not alive, not safe, but found. Her family began planning the funeral. Officers from across the state promised to attend. Citizens who had followed her story for years sent flowers and messages. The city prepared to honor the detective who had given everything in her fight for justice. For the family, it was a strange mix of relief and agony. They could finally bury her, give her a grave, speak to her as more than a memory, but every moment reminded them of what she had endured. Her younger sibling spoke to reporters. She was not just missing, she was taken, she suffered, and someone let it happen. The public was shaken. The story was no longer just about a detective who vanished. It was about betrayal, corruption, and silence that had lasted too long. At the funeral, hundreds gathered. The flag on her casket was folded and handed to her parents. Bagpipes played, officers saluted, and the family wept. She was no longer a ghost in the shadows of missing. She was finally laid to rest. But the nightmare of what she endured was only beginning to sink in. The moment the news broke, it exploded across the country. A missing detective sergeant, gone for 13 years, found in a locked cellar beneath an old house. It was the kind of story that made headlines everywhere. People asked the same question. How could this have happened? How could a trained, respected officer disappear and no one uncover the truth for more than a decade? The media ran non-stop coverage. TV anchors replayed the discovery, showing pictures of the property, the cellar, the sealed door. Newspapers printed her photo next to the words, "Found after 13 years." Reporters demanded answers from the police department. Why had so many leads gone cold? Why hadn't that property been searched earlier? And most importantly, how had evidence of her captivity remained hidden in plain sight for so long? Families of other missing persons spoke out, saying if this could happen to a detective, what chance did regular citizens have? The public was furious. Trust in law enforcement cracked. Press conferences were tense. Officials stumbled over their words. They promised a full review but gave few details. For the family, the media storm was overwhelming. Cameras followed them everywhere. Journalists crowded their lawn demanding interviews. Yet the family kept repeating the same message. She was failed. Someone knew. Someone looked the other way. Behind the scenes, investigations began. Lawmakers called for hearings. Citizens demanded accountability. The name of Detective Sergeant Claire Nolan was now not just a tragedy. It was a national scandal. Her story had become bigger than one disappearance. It had become a mirror, showing the public how corruption, silence, and neglect could hide even the most shocking crimes. And people weren't going to let it go quietly. Once the Cellar discovery hit the headlines, the pressure on the police department became unbearable. Internal Affairs launched an investigation, and outside agencies were brought in to review old files. Very quickly, troubling details surfaced. Reports showed that years earlier, tips about the property had come in but were never followed. Notes had vanished from case files. Some evidence appeared to have been misplaced. The big question was unavoidable. Had corrupt officers helped hide the truth? Investigators interviewed dozens of people inside the department. A few officers admitted they had suspicions about colleagues but had stayed silent out of fear. Others denied everything. Eventually, a handful of officers were disciplined. Some were suspended. One even lost his badge. But the punishments were small compared to the scale of what had been hidden. The public wasn't satisfied. If Claire Nolan had been investigating powerful criminals, how deep did the ties go? And if those criminals had friends in uniform, how many people had looked the other way? On talk shows, analysts argued that the case proved the system protected itself first and the truth second. Protesters gathered outside police headquarters, holding signs that read, "Justice for Claire and who's protecting us?" For the family, it was even more painful. They had begged police for years to search harder, to dig deeper. Now they knew some officers might have deliberately ignored the answers. But the worst part was this. Most of the people who might have been involved escaped any real consequences. Files went missing. Memories faded. Without hard proof, investigators couldn't push charges. So while a few names were tarnished, many others walked away untouched. The family said it best in one interview. They gave us closure but not justice. The day of the funeral was unlike anything the city had seen in years. Streets around the church were lined with people holding flowers and candles. Police cars blocked traffic, their lights flashing softly, not in urgency, but in respect. Hundreds of officers stood shoulder to shoulder in dress uniforms. Many had never even met Detective Sergeant Claire Nolan, but they knew what she stood for. She was one of their own, and she had paid the ultimate price. When the family arrived, silence fell. Her younger sibling, who had spent over a decade fighting for answers, walked behind the casket with tears streaming down their face. Reporters didn't shout questions. The cameras clicked quietly. For once, the media simply bore witness. The casket was draped with the national flag. On top lay her police cap and badge, carefully polished. The sight was overwhelming. People in the crowd cried openly, strangers hugging each other as if they had lost someone in their own family. Inside the church, every seat was filled. The air was heavy with grief but also with pride. A chaplain spoke about Claire's courage, calling her a fighter who refused to bow to fear or corruption. Colleagues stepped up to the podium, some choking on their words, remembering how she had pushed cases no one else dared touch. Her sibling gave the most powerful speech of the day. Voice shaking but steady, they said. She didn't die because she was weak. She died because she was strong, because she believed the truth was worth everything, even her life. If we let her story fade, then the people who did this win. And we cannot let that happen. The room erupted in applause. Officers saluted. Citizens stood. The sound of respect filled the walls, cutting through the grief. After the service, the casket was carried outside. A long line of patrol cars followed as the funeral procession moved through the city. Residents lined sidewalks, holding signs that read, "Rest in power, Claire," and "Thank you for your service." At the cemetery, a final salute was given. Bagpipes played. As the casket was lowered, the family clutched each other tightly. Claire Nolan was finally at rest, but her fight and her story was far from over. After the funeral, the family held a small gathering at the community hall nearby. People packed inside, friends, neighbors, retired officers, and strangers who only knew Claire's story from the news. The air buzzed with grief, but also with determination. Everyone knew her death could not be the end of the fight. When the room quieted, Claire's younger sibling stepped forward. They had been her voice for over a decade, never letting her case fade away. Now, standing at the microphone, they looked exhausted yet unbroken. Their hands trembled slightly as they held their notes, but when they spoke, their voice carried through the hall with strength. "My sister spent her life chasing the truth," they said, "even when it scared her, even when it made her enemies. She believed that justice mattered more than fear, and because of that she was taken from us." The room was silent. Some wiped their eyes, others nodded, knowing the words were true. "But let me be clear," the sibling continued. "Her voice will not be buried in that cellar. Her fight does not end with her. I will carry it. We will carry it. And as long as I breathe, I will demand answers. No matter who is guilty, no matter how high the corruption goes." Applause broke out, rising until the hall shook with the sound. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was raw, angry, determined. The community was making a promise too. The sibling raised their hand for quiet. "Some people want us to move on, to let her become a sad memory, just another cold case. But I will not, because my sister believed silence protects the guilty, and I refuse to stay silent." The crowd stood to their feet. For many, this was the first time they felt hope since her body had been found. Claire's story was no longer just about loss. It had become a call to action. That day, the siblings' vow became part of the city's history. People repeated it in newspapers, in schools, in homes. "Silence protects the guilty. We refuse to stay silent." Claire Nolan was gone, but her voice through her family was louder than ever. After the funeral and the siblings' powerful vow, Claire's case transformed from a single family's tragedy into something far bigger. Across the country, her name was no longer just a headline. It became a symbol. People began to say her story was proof of what happens when someone dares to stand against the wrong people. Claire was remembered as a detective who refused to look the other way. She pushed into organized crime cases that others avoided. She questioned people in power who thought they were untouchable. And in the end, it cost her everything. The media framed her story in two ways. Some called her a hero who stood tall against criminals. Others pointed to the silence around her disappearance as a warning that those with power could bury the truth for over a decade. The phrase repeated again and again: "Silence protects the guilty." In schools, her name was taught in lessons about justice. In police academies, recruits were told about the risks of ignoring corruption. For her city, her face on murals and posters wasn't just about remembrance. It was a reminder that justice was fragile, and it depended on people willing to fight for it. But the symbol cut both ways. To her family, it was painful. They didn't want Claire remembered only as a story of corruption or mystery. She had been a daughter, a sister, a friend. They wanted people to remember her laugh, her kindness, the way she lit up a room when she walked in. Still, they understood that her story had taken on a larger meaning, one they couldn't control. Politicians gave speeches promising reform. Some new laws were passed to protect whistleblowers and strengthen oversight on cases involving missing officers. But many people felt it wasn't enough. They argued that as long as certain names remained untouched, Claire's fight wasn't truly honored. Community groups carried on her legacy, hosting yearly events on the anniversary of her disappearance. They marched with signs that read, "Justice for Claire, justice for all." Her sibling often spoke at these events, repeating the same vow, that silence would never be allowed to win. Over time, Claire became a figure almost larger than life. Her face, once on missing posters, was now painted on walls as a sign of courage. Students wrote essays about her. Activists carried her story into protests about corruption and organized crime. And yet through all of it, one haunting truth remained. The full story of what happened to her in that cellar, who ordered it, who helped cover it, who looked away, was never fully revealed. Some pieces were uncovered, but many were buried for good. That's why, even as she became a national symbol, there was always an emptiness to the legacy. She represented both courage and silence, the bravery to fight, and the silence that allowed her killers to hide for so long. To this day, her name carries weight. To speak it is to speak about the cost of truth. To remember her is to remember how fragile justice can be when power is left unchecked. Claire Nolan wasn't just the detective who vanished. She became a mirror for the nation, a reminder that silence doesn't just hide the guilty, it destroys the brave. Even after the funeral, after the speeches, after the investigations and the public outrage, something still lingered, questions that refused to go away. Yes, the Cellar had given an answer to the most painful mystery, where Claire had been all those years. But with that answer came a flood of darker doubts. People whispered, was every accomplice really brought to light? Investigators claimed they followed the evidence, but many doubted it. Too many powerful names had hovered on the edge of suspicion. Too many leads had been cut short. Was it possible some of the very people trusted to protect her had a hand in her disappearance? Reporters asked, why did it take 13 years to find her, when the house sat in plain sight the whole time? Was it simple neglect, or something deliberate? The idea that a decorated detective could vanish and remain hidden for so long made people wonder if part of the truth had been buried on purpose. Even in the police force, whispers carried on. Younger officers, who hadn't been around during Claire's disappearance, looked at the old guard with suspicion. Some wondered quietly if their mentors had known more than they admitted, but no one dared say it too loudly. The risk of accusing the wrong person was too great. For the family, closure was complicated. They knew where Claire was now. They could visit her grave, but they still didn't know exactly how she had been taken, how long she had lived in that cellar, or who all the players were. Every night, her sibling replayed the same thought. Someone out there still knows the full story. The community felt the same. Town halls filled with residents asking if justice had really been done. Some believed the case was wrapped up neatly to quiet the outrage. Others believed pieces of evidence had been buried, just like Claire had been. The truth became almost like a ghost, always close, but never fully seen. In the end, the locked cellar had solved one part of the mystery, but it also created another, who had walked away free, who had covered their tracks so carefully that even now no one could touch them. The story of Detective Sergeant Claire Nolan was no longer just about a disappearance. It was about the questions that still hung heavy in the air, questions that may never be answered. And maybe that was the most chilling part of all.